Today's show is brought to you by our sponsors at Betterment Advisor Solutions. Imagining a better future is the first step. Investing in that future with Betterment Advisor Solutions is the next. Whether you're launching your own practice, looking to streamline your client onboarding, or just searching for efficient ways to scale your firm, Betterment Advisor Solutions is here to help. They automate to make tax optimization simpler. They provide support to make administrative tasks easier. At Betterment Advisor Solutions, they are building innovative technologies, all for anyone who's ever said, I think I can do better. So grow your RIA your way with Betterment Advisor Solutions. Learn more at betterment.com/advisors. That's betterment.com/advisors. Investing involves risk. Performance is not guaranteed. Welcome back to the Unlock, the channel we built for all things wealth management. This is Ben with Benefits. On today's show, I am joined by our very own Nick Maggiulli. He works with me at Ritholtz Wealth Management. He's the author of the blog of Dollars and Data. Nick, you wrote a piece recently called Give Now, Not Later. What was the genesis of the piece there?
The genesis of the piece, I ran a Twitter poll a long time ago, and I basically said, would you rather have $250,000 at age 30, $500,000 at age 40, or $1 million at age 50, right? As an inheritance, right? Assuming you're getting inheritance from somebody. And overwhelmingly, like 70% of the participants voted $250K at age 30. And just for the math geeks out there, those numbers are equivalent as if you took the $250K and got a 7% inflation adjusted return for 10 years, you'd get to $500K at 40, and then you got another 7% inflation adjusted return for 10 more years, you'd have $1 million at 50, right? So it's like, even if I could guarantee you a 7% inflation adjusted return, people would still prefer less money earlier in time, right? So that goes to show that it's not just, people care about things other than just like total purchasing power at certain points in time. It's the optionality. And I think it's so funny because a lot of people said, oh, I'd prefer the money earlier in time. But if you actually look at the inheritance data, most of the money that's actually given in the United States comes later in time. And the average age of inheritance is getting later and later. I think it's 51 now. It's the average age when someone in the United States receives inheritance is 51. So I think there's this disconnect between what people want and what actually happens. And of course, there's a lot of issues we can get into and kind of why we're discussing it today. But I basically argued try and give earlier, not later. And the reason why is because it can have so much of a bigger impact on, your children's lives because of the optionality that it provides. So even giving a smaller amount earlier in time can have a much bigger impact than a much larger amount later in time. And that's right, kind of the idea.
Yeah, even a smaller amount of money early in life, because we're talking student loans, maybe a down payment for a house, which is really hard these days, a wedding. Kids are super duper expensive. So when someone has their young kids and they're paying for daycare and strollers and all that stuff. So you looked at this data from the researchers at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I think you found the median age is like 56 to 65 or something when people get the inheritance. And it makes sense if you think about it, because if you look at just the actuarial tables, in one of his books, Charlie Ellis talks about how if you have a couple who's married today at 65, they both retire at 65, there's like a 50 or 60% chance one of them lives well into their 90s. And the other studies show that also wealthier people tend to live longer, right? So if you're thinking as a millennial, someday that's my meal ticket, you could be in your 60s by the time you get the money when maybe it doesn't make as much of a difference to you anymore. It doesn't move the needle as much.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the other thing. It's like, how much is, $2 million worth to you at 70 versus, even 200,000 at 30? I mean, we could make the money, we can move the numbers as much as we want. And you can see that you're not going to be able to change your lifestyle as much at age 70 as you can at age 30. Right. And so I think that's kind of the big takeaway here.
So it's also worth mentioning from that study that most of the money being passed down is done by the wealthy, which sounds obvious, but so the top 10% own 87% of the stock market. When you look at this average inheritance by income percentile, that kind of tells a story too. It really is the top 10%, and I guess even more so the top 1% or so. So there's all these studies that show the numbers are seemingly made up, but they say in the next 20 or 30 years, there's going to be $80 trillion passed down, or 120, whatever the number is. A lot of that is going to be by wealthy individuals, right? And so they're getting most of the money.
Yeah, and the typical inheritance, and so I'm just looking at the chart now, and they can probably throw it up, the average inheritance by income percentile. So between, as you said, from the 10th to the 90th percentile, like the difference in total inheritance is, it's not that different. It's anywhere from, 150 to upwards of maybe $180,000. But once you go above the 90th percentile, you go to the 95th percentile, it's 200,000. Once you go to the 99th percentile, the average goes to 400,000, right? And it probably goes up from there. We just don't even have data on this. But it goes to show how much of like this is being driven by the ultra wealthy. So like basically if your parents aren't above the 90th percentile, you're probably going to get the same size inheritance regardless, but it's just interesting to show that, you know.
Right. Now, there's obviously some psychological components, and I've talked about this, I've written about this, and when I hear from baby boomers, it's usually two things. One is, listen, I was raised by parents of the Great Depression, right? My parents, the baby boomer parents, were from the Great Depression. They had this mindset of, you hoard your money and you hold on to it, and it's hard for me to let it go. The other thing is, well, listen, we're living longer than our parents did too. They might have had 10 or 15 years in retirement, and most of them died young. We're living much longer. And so we're really worried about our money outlasting our money. It's longevity risk. So how do you answer that type of thing?
No, it's a fair point. I think especially within the United States, it's a little bit even more complicated because what we find, there's actually some academic literature out there that one of the biggest reasons why people quote oversave, they have more than they're ever going to spend, right? You can run all the calculations you want and they'll never spend down their wealth. One of the reasons for that is people are very scared about having some really intense, healthcare outcome that leads to them spending a lot of that money, right? And it's things they can't anticipate, right? And as you know, I mean, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but most of the healthcare spending happens in the last few years of life, right? It's probably over half. And so it's like really that I think that's the hedge, and people are so worried about that. What's interesting though about a lot of these studies is they show that like the people who are, particularly don't have a lot of assets, they just rely on Medicaid and they get this, they get the care, right? They may not get the same quality of care as someone who's quite wealthy, but they'll still get care. And so I think there's, what do I say to someone? Like, think about, okay, well, there's a difference between, giving nothing and waiting until you pass and giving like half your wealth to your children right now. I think there's a good medium. And where is that? I don't know. And it's whatever you feel comfortable with, but it's finding that place where you feel like you can give something and help out, your children in some way or your grandchildren, but not giving up so much that you're actually worried about running out of money, right? And I think the problem is everyone's at that one edge of the spectrum and no one's near that. Like the whole die with zero stuff, I think I love the idea, but I also think it's really extreme and most people can never do it, right? So I think die with zero is directionally more accurate than what's going on today, though. And so yes, I think even moving us back to like kind of die with closer to zero is a better philosophy than like die with, $4 million in assets,
Yeah. Even the idea of, hey, for Christmas this year, you're getting a $5,000 or $10,000 check could have a huge, huge impact on a young person versus the old person who that might not even move the needle that much. I think the die with zero, the thing to me that is interesting about that idea is he says, listen, your net worth should peak in like your mid 50s and it should go down. Like you shouldn't shoot for the peak to be when you retire. It should be in your mid 50s because you want to spend when you're healthier. And if you look at actual spending amounts, this is the other thing. People worry about healthcare. If you look at the median spending amounts, and the US government puts this out, it does peak in about your 50s and it goes down every decade after that, right?
Yeah, and retirement, it drops by about 1% a year on average.
Yeah, so your spending goes down. And so I think that's one other way to think about it. And you've looked at the studies with me before, that EBRI study that shows they look at the first 20 years of people's spending habits in retirement. And I think they said the people with the most money, like $500,000 or more, spend like 12% of their nest egg. And most people just spend like the income from their portfolio and they don't touch the principal because they're so worried about it. And you always reference that Kitsy study. What does that one say about how much more money you can end up with following the 4% rule?
Yeah, if you follow the 4% rule with a 60-40 portfolio, you're more likely to end up with 4 times your wealth than you are to end up going below your starting balance. So if you started retirement at 65 with $1 million, and remember, this is using real historical data. If you started 65 at $1 million, you followed the 4% rule, 30 years later, you're more likely to have 4 times your starting balance than you are to be below your starting balance, which is like shocking. So it shows like the upside potential is there and people they don't spend enough. And I'm not criticizing people for not spending enough, but it just shows there is a little bit of leeway there for giving more away. Now, some people will say, well, Nick, I already know the common thing. What about taxes, Nick? I wanted the stepped up basis so my children don't have to pay taxes. Well, okay, if you have an estate that's greater than, assuming a husband and a wife, if they have an estate greater than $28 million, then yes, you have to worry about something like this. But right now, you can gift up to per individual $13.99 million in your lifetime and skip the estate tax, right? So I'm less worried about those types of things. And so obviously taxes are a very complex issue and it's not true of every single thing, but I think there are pieces of this. I'm not saying to give up your house. So that's another piece of this, but there are ways to do this that minimize taxes. And you just have to have it. It's a part of your exemption, right? So, and once again, most people are never going to have anywhere near $28 million in assets. So it's not an issue. So you can gift a lot of stuff without them having to pay taxes on it.
Right.
So
I also think so. The people we're talking to in this channel is advisors, and they're the ones who are dealing with the top 10% in most cases, right? It is the wealthy individuals, and so there obviously are people who are so worried about longevity risk, and they're going to rely more on Social Security, and their nest egg isn't big enough to give as much. But for the people that can, I think this is honestly where a good financial advisor can provide a huge helping hand to their clients, just to give them permission to spend or permission to give. Listen, we've run your numbers. You're going to be fine if you give your kids 20 grand a year to help them out or whatever the number is. I think that's where a good financial advisor can come in and say, like, you're going to be okay if you spend this money on yourself or pass it along. Because you in your piece, you lay out some different ways you can. It's not just about giving cash. There's other things you can do. So what else did you lay out in terms of like how people could actually give the money or use it in a different way than just passing it along when they die?
yeah, you don't have to just straight up give them a cash transfer. And once again, the IRS allows you to give, I think it's like $15,000 a year, and there's no taxes on it. Once you go above the 15,000, you have to do a separate filing for that lifetime exclusion. But in terms of different things you can do, you can pay for education. Think about your children's education, your grandchildren's education, or pre-K, things like that. You can help with the down payment, things we've already talked about. Family planning needs. Is that a wedding? Is that, any sort of, maybe a family reunion? You want to do those, family vacations. There's like all these different things you can do. And then lastly, yes, you can give beyond the exclusion, right? And so, yeah, so actually, I apologize. The limit's $19,000 per child per year, tax free. So you can give $19,000 to any one of your family members every single year, and then there's no taxes on it. Once you go above the 19, then you have to start counting it against your lifetime exclusion. So there's a lot of ways to do this, and it doesn't have to be in a direct transfer, but like, be creative with it. There's a lot of things you can do. Support their creative projects. Like, oh, hey, you want to start a business? I'll help you start that. Get equity out of it. I mean, there's a lot of ways where you could even benefit and you're helping them at the same time. So like, I'm open to these ideas. I just think there's a lot of people, I think it would be a tragedy if you end up dying with, $10 million that could have helped, or $5 million that could have helped your children much earlier in life. And I think that's kind of more of the issue. So I kind of agree with like, where should your net worth peak? Yeah, somewhere between your 50s and 60s. And ideally, you're kind of giving enough away. So maybe your net worth doesn't keep going up, but it kind of stays level over the years. So
I also think selfishly, if you want to actually see other people, and if you're one of these people who just can't force yourself to enjoy the money, because we know the psychological reason for this, you spend 40 years saving and saving and saving and building up the nest egg, and then it's really hard to hit the switch and say, all right, now I'm going to decumulate. I'm just going to spend it all and not worry, because that's a very hard thing to change those habits. So I understand why people get in the mentality, and some people just can't help themselves, or they just like my father was never a material person, never liked to buy clothes, and so he has, and I've worked on them on this over the years. He's been retired, and so he takes his RMDs out every year, and he doesn't want to spend the money on himself, so he puts it in the kids' 529 plans, right?
perfect.
Or my mother and father-in-law had their 50th wedding anniversary this year, and they took the whole family on a trip to the Dominican Republic. Right? They paid for it. They wanted to do this. They were kind of saying this is like an early inheritance, and that way you get to enjoy it, and then you get to watch other people enjoy it as well. So that's part of it too. Is you're right. It's not just giving the cash. I think you can help others enjoy the money now too. And even if you say like this could mean a lower inheritance in the future, how many kids are going to say no, put it off. I want it then, because those experiences are so much better, right?
Yeah, exactly. No one says that. And all the data, trust me, I've looked at this. I've asked people multiple times. I've asked people in person. I've done big studies on Twitter and all this stuff. I mean, polls. And every single time, it's overwhelmingly earlier in time. People want it earlier. And you ask yourself, is that what would I want? And you're going to be like, yeah, I probably want it earlier. So your kids are going to want that too. Now, how you do it and the right way, of course, there's more complications. If you think when your children's really bad with money, you give them money and it's going to lead down a bad path, that's a different conversation. But there's a lot of things you can do. I think the example you gave, Ben, of like, oh, I'm going to pay for a family vacation and I'm going to get to enjoy that. It's like obviously you guys are going to get less inheritance, but this memory is more important than an extra, 10 grand or 5 or whatever it was going to be, an extra few grand per person at this event. Right. And so I think that's a good point.
I also think that there's some idea where some young people feel like I'm getting screwed here because it's more expensive for me for housing. It's more expensive for me for daycare, student loans, all these things that my parents never had to go through. And they get mad at the older generation and be like, why can't you see how I'm suffering? And sometimes the older generation, I think, is just kind of oblivious to it and maybe just not understanding. And I do think that part of it is generational in that a lot of the boomers think, well, this is what happened in my parents' generation. They passed on their inheritance. This is how they did it. That's how I'm going to do it. So I think, what do you think about kids actually having the conversation with their parents? Because some parents just might not know that, hey, you need it now. It'll be helpful. Like, how do you approach those conversations, which could be tricky, especially in families that maybe don't talk about money very much, which is most of them.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's incredibly difficult to have those conversations. It's a tough conversation in general. The good news, though, is like I've seen some studies recently that showed that like I don't know if it was, and I remember you read a headline, you don't know how good the survey is, right? And so it says something like 50% of millennials and Gen Z have gotten some sort of financial support or getting some sort of regular financial support, whether that's like a down payment on a house or they're getting help with rent or something. So I think it is happening more today than it's happened previously. So this type of stuff is happening. So I don't know the right way to approach that. And like, so I think what you'd have to do is just, say, hey, like, here's the realities. It's really tough with all this stuff. Like, I don't know anything about your financial situation, but I could use help, and just be honest about it and be like, yeah, you can leave me an inheritance later, but that's going to be less impactful. Like that's it. Just be on. I think the truthful thing, don't say, oh, well, you have all this money and you're not doing anything. Don't say that. You have to say like, what's going to have the biggest impact on me is if you help me now versus me waiting 20 years and then you hand me however much money you end up having by then, which could be a lot more. Right. And so I think just being honest and having that conversation and like, I need help. Like, here's why. Like, things are more expensive. When you were in college, like you could have done, or when you graduated college, you could have bought a house for this. You adjust for incomes and stuff. It's this much higher. Like all these types of things I think are helpful. Once again, it's not an easy conversation. I wish I had the answer for that.
Yeah.
So.
And I do think, again, this is where a good financial advisor comes in because so much of that money is going to be passed down. I know for years and years, people have been worried about, well, what happens when all the baby boomers go to sell their stocks, and is that going to crash the stock market? And my retort has always been, listen, most of that money is going to be passed on to the next generation. They're not going to touch it because they're not going to spend it, and it's going to be passed on, and it's got an even longer time horizon. And so I think a financial advisor who can help sort of bring those two generations together and have that conversation, and they be the impartial third party, they're potentially auditioning for a job with working with the kids and keeping that money, right? Because I know a lot of young people for us have said, hey, listen, my parents had their guy who was a brokerage person basically, and I did not want to use them. I moved the money immediately. So I think advisors bridging the gap between those generations, that's like auditioning for another role to keep yourself in the family money basically for a while.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's actually a core function of something that advisors should do. It should bring everyone in the family in and have these conversations and start it early. And because you do want to try and help and add as much value. I mean, even if they end up leaving, like you're going to be adding value to that person's life while they're there, And so I think that's helpful in its own right. And yeah, maybe some of those people will leave, but some of them will stay. And so it's not just self-interested for the advisor, but I do think it's just something that does generally help the family. And probably, I obviously don't have hard data on this anywhere. I bet there's a study that's been done at some point, but it shows that those clients stick around more. You probably have better, retention as a result by having more people included, right?
Yeah.
Versus, it's always better to have, the husband and the wife there or whoever, right? Versus just one of the members of the family. You're going to get far less buy-in than when the whole family's there and agrees with the vision you're putting forward.
Yeah, you want to get away from something where either side is resentful of the other side because of the money. It's also important. I think Abigail Disney did this study because she talked about how basically having all the money in her family maybe kind of messed her up a little bit. And she cited this study. It was like the Chronicle of Philanthropy or something. And they asked everyone who inherited money. It was large and small. How much money did you inherit? Okay, here's that number. What amount of money would you need to feel totally secure based on an inheritance? They said every single person said double the amount they got, basically, right? So like the inheritance is not going to probably make you any happier. It might make your life easier. It might take some stress away from you, and it might make you a little more comfortable. But it's probably not going to make you happy, as we know from all the other studies on money and happiness.
Yeah. I mean, there's that joke that I know Michael Batnick quotes this a lot. It's the Rockefeller line where they asked, when Rockefeller was the richest man in the world, some reporter asked him, how much money is enough? And he said, just a little bit more. And so it's a classic, but I agree. Like, that's the whole thing. Like, you say, hey, once I get to this level, I'll be okay. But you get there and then you're like, yeah, actually, maybe I just need a little bit more because of this. Prices went up or that one. You can justify this all day. But I think that study really shows what's happening here.
Yeah. Okay, Nick, tell everyone where they can go subscribe to your newsletter.
You can find me at ofdollars&data.com, and you can find my newsletter there. And yeah, follow along. Thank you so much for your time.
If you are an advisor, subscribe to our newsletter at advisorunlock.com. We're sharing everything you need to know about this business to get ahead, stay ahead, all things wealth management, technology, all these things. Subscribe to the Unlock on YouTube channel as well, and we will see you next time.
All right, thank you.